The radio didn't call for an ambulance. It called for a mop. A voice crackled in the dark, total loss at mile 86. The driver is just meat in a flannel shirt. Left arm missing. Jeans soaked in fresh coffee. I looked down. My coffee was spilled. It was still burning my skin. I checked the clock. The crash happened 10 minutes ago. I'm not driving a truck anymore. I'm driving my own coffin. Welcome to the graveyard shift. You're tuned into Night Route Horrors. Lock your doors and hit subscribe if you want to make it to sunrise. Because on this channel, the GPS only leads to hell. Tonight's dispatch takes us to Interstate 80. 3 a.m. Let's drive. The world outside ceased to exist hours ago. Now, only the cone of illumination remained. 2 halogen beams cut through the white void, fighting a losing war against the Wyoming night. The snow did not fall, it attacked. Driven by 50-mile-per-hour crosswinds, the flakes transformed into horizontal streaks of static, a mesmerizing, strobe-light assault that battered the windshield of the Peterbilt 379. Frank Miller sat enthroned in the center of the chaos, a statue of exhaustion molded into cracked black leather. The dashboard clock glowed a sickly, dim amber, 3 a.m. Interstate 80 had vanished. The asphalt, the lane markers, the horizon, gone. Under the 18 wheels of the rig, the road surface was a rumor, a treacherous sheet of black ice hidden beneath ribbons of drifting powder that slithered across the path like white snakes. The only proof of motion came from the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the suspension and the relentless, gut-shaking vibration of the 15-liter diesel engine. Frank shifted his weight. His spine popped, a dry, brittle sound lost under the roar of the wind. 52 years of gravity and bad posture had fused him to this seat. His hands, stained with grease and etched with deep crow's feet, gripped the wheel with the desperation of a drowning man holding a lifeline. He didn't steer the truck so much as negotiate with it. The Peterbilt was a massive, groaning beast of steel and chrome, a fortress against the storm, yet tonight it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The cab smelled of stale vices. A pungent cocktail of burnt diesel, old vinyl, and the sour, metallic tang of unwashed human skin hung heavy in the air. To his right, the passenger seat had long since surrendered its function. It served now as a graveyard for the road's detritus, a mountain of crumpled fast food wrappers, empty Red Bull cans, and a yellowed logbook buried under a plastic grocery bag that overflowed onto the rubber floor mat. Frank's eyes burned. The grit of fatigue felt like sand under his lids. He blinked, fighting the heavy pull of highway hypnosis. The wipers slapped against the glass, a metronome counting down seconds that stretched into eternity. Slap. 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 He needed to focus. The gauges on the dash stared back at him, chrome-bezeled eyes monitoring the heart rate of the machine. Oil pressure steady. Water temp low. Air pressure holding. His gaze drifted to the altar cluttered near the speedometer, a bobblehead with a missing spring that nodded furiously with every bump, and a faded photograph taped to the plastic trim. The photo curled at the edges, the image of the smiling girl almost bleached out by years of sun, but he didn't look at it directly. He never did. He let it exist in his periphery, a ghost haunting the dashboard. The wind howled, a roar like a jet engine constantly taking off, shaking the cab. The plastic trim squeaked. The door seal near his left knee leaked a razor-thin draft of freezing air, biting through his denim. "Come on, old girl," Frank grunted. His voice was a gravelly baritone, and used for hours, sounding foreign in the enclosed space. "Keep it between the ditches." He reached for the pack of Marlboros sliding across the dash, his fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear, Frank Miller didn't do fear, not anymore, but from the vibration. The truck demanded a toll from his body, shaking his joints loose, rattling his fillings until his teeth ached. He shook a cigarette free, placed it between his lips, but didn't light it. The ritual was enough. The road descended. The engine brake barked, a staccato machine gun rattle that vibrated through the floorboards and up into his boots. He watched the West Coast mirror. Nothing. No headlights behind him. No tail lights ahead. The isolation was absolute. It was just Frank, the rig, and the white void. He was driving through purgatory. A sudden gust slammed into the trailer. The entire rig listed to the right, the chassis groaning under the strain. Frank corrected, fighting the wheel. The steering locked like stone for a fraction of a second, the Peterbilt resisting him, testing him, before surrendering to his grip. "Easy," he whispered. His throat felt like he had swallowed broken glass. He needed caffeine. His hand left the wheel and groped blindly for the travel mug wedged into the cup holder. It was a muscle memory, a movement he had performed 10,000 times in 20 years. His fingers brushed the cold stainless steel. He gripped it, lifting the vessel toward his lips. The front right steer tire found a crater hidden beneath the snow. Bang. The impact was violent, a bone-jarring shudder that traveled instantly from the axle to the steering column to Frank's skeleton. The cab lurched violently to the side. Frank cursed, his grip tightening on the wheel to keep the 80,000-pound missile from jackknifing. In the chaos, the lid of the mug popped loose. Lukewarm, bitter liquid surged out, splashing heavily onto his lap. Son of a bitch. Frank slammed the mug back into the holder, the liquid sloshing over the rim. He looked down. A large, dark stain spread rapidly across the faded denim of his left thigh. The heat of the coffee had long since faded, leaving only a tepid, sticky dampness that seeped through the fabric, chilling his skin instantly in the drafty cab. He grabbed a fast food napkin from the passenger seat pile and scrubbed at the mess, but the damage was done. The dark blotch stood out starkly against the pale blue of his Wranglers, an ugly, irregular shape resembling a burn mark. Perfect, he muttered, tossing the sodden napkin onto the floor. Just perfect. He checked the mirrors again. Still nothing. The adrenaline from the pothole began to fade, replaced by a sullen irritation. He wiped his hand on his flannel shirt, leaving a faint streak of brown on the plaid. The silence returned, heavier than before. The wind seemed to hold its breath for a moment, the roar dropping to a low, menacing hum. Even the rattle of the dash quieted. Then, the radio came alive. It wasn't the usual crackle of the CB, the friendly garbage of truckers trading warnings about bears or road closures. This was different. It cut through the cabin's atmosphere like a scalpel. KZZZHHHHT. Static. Harsh, white noise that matched the visual snow outside. It spiked in volume, drowning out the engine, drowning out the wind. Frank reached for the volume knob to kill it. All units, be advised, a voice said. Frank's hand froze inches from the dial. The voice was wrong. It possessed no warmth, no cadence of human speech. It sounded cold, clinical, precise, like a police dispatcher stripped of empathy, or a sophisticated AI reading a grocery list. It carried a digital crispness that shouldn't exist on the analog waves of a CB radio in the middle of a Wyoming dead zone. We are at the scene at mile marker 86, the voice continued, smooth and terrible. Vehicle is a Peterbilt 379. License plate, X-ray, Yankee, 9er, Lima. Frank's breath hitched. XY942L. He stared at the dashboard, his mind reeling. He knew that plate. He had stared at it every morning during his pre-trip inspection. He had written it on thousands of logbooks. It was his plate. Must be a mistake, he whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Glitch. Crossed wires. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He scanned the road ahead. The green reflectors on the shoulder flashed by. Flash. 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 He waited for the punchline. Some joker with a scanner, messing with him. Some bored kid with a high-powered radio kit. The static hissed, a serpentine sound. We have one confirmed fatality in the cab, the voice stated. The tone remained flat, bored, administrative. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, instantly freezing in the draft. A fatality. He was driving. He was right here. The engine was thrumming beneath him. The smell of the spilled coffee was sharp in his nose. Repeat, the voice said, clearer now, as if the speaker were sitting in the passenger seat. One confirmed fatality. Male subject, approximately 50 years of age. Frank squeezed his eyes shut and opened them again. The road was still there. The snow was still flying. Subject is wearing a red and black flannel shirt, the voice droned. Frank looked down at his chest. Red and black plaid. Standard issue. Half the drivers on the road wore flannel. It meant nothing. It was a coincidence. A sick guess. And blue jeans, the voice added. Standard. Everyone wore jeans. With a fresh coffee stain on the left thigh. The air left the cab. Frank stopped breathing. The sound of the engine seemed to recede, moving miles away, leaving him in a bubble of absolute, terrified silence. Slowly, with a dread that made his movements heavy and robotic, Frank lowered his gaze. The stain was there. Dark. Wet. Irregular. Soaking into the denim on his left leg. The coffee he had spilled 60 seconds ago. The voice on the radio didn't pause. It didn't gloat. It simply reported. Time of death declared at 3:15 a.m. Frank's head snapped to the dashboard clock. The amber digits burned into his retinas. 3:08 a.m. 7 minutes. He stared at the numbers, waiting for them to change, waiting for the logic of the world to reassert itself. But the colon between the numbers merely blinked. Blink. 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 The road stretched out ahead, leading into the dark. Frank snatched the CB microphone from its chrome clip, the coiled cord snapping taut like a black tendon. He keyed the button, his thumb mashing the plastic with enough force to whiten the nail bed. "Who is this?" he barked. The gravel in his voice scraped against the silence of the cab. "Breaker 19. Identify yourself. This ain't funny." The static ignored him. The white noise hissed, a venomous backdrop to the clinical drone of the voice. It did not pause. It did not acknowledge the interruption. It simply continued its recitation of the impossible. Subject vehicle lost traction on black ice at the entry to the Elk Creek Bridge, the voice stated. It possessed the flat, hollow timbre of a recording, yet the clarity was piercing, bypassing the speakers to resonate directly in the base of Frank's skull. Correction. Vehicle jackknifed. Tractor detached from kingpin. Rollover initiated. "I said shut the hell up," Frank roared. He slammed the mic against the dashboard. The plastic casing cracked against the vinyl, but the voice remained steady, unbothered by the violence. Cab integrity compromised, the dispatcher continued. Roof structure collapsed upon impact with the Jersey barrier. Driver sustained fatal blunt force trauma to the cranium and upper thorax. Compression asphyxia noted. Frank's stomach turned over. Bile rose in his throat, hot and acidic. The description was too specific. Too anatomical. He wasn't listening to a prank, he was listening to an autopsy report. His autopsy report. The Peterbilt groaned. A gust of wind hammered the passenger side, pushing the 80,000-pound rig toward the center line. Frank fought the wheel, his biceps burning. The leather wrap felt slick under his palms. Sweat slicked his skin despite the biting draft slicing through the door seal. He glanced at the windshield. The snow was a hypnotic tunnel, a vortex of white lines rushing toward him. Somewhere inside that blinding swirl lay the Elk Creek Bridge. He had driven this route 1,000 times. He could drive it blindfolded. But tonight, the geography felt hostile, rearranged by the storm into a trap. Estimated time of crash, the voice droned, 3:15 a.m. Frank's eyes darted to the dash. 3:09 a.m. 6 minutes. The numbers didn't change. The colon pulsed. Blink. Blink. Bullshit, Frank whispered, the word trembling on his lips. It's bullshit. I'm right here. I'm breathing. He looked down at his leg again. The coffee stain was a dark island on his jeans, cold and damp against his skin. Fresh coffee stain on the left thigh. The evidence was undeniable. The universe had written a script, and he was currently acting out the final scene. Emergency services dispatched, the voice added, indifferent. Recovery of remains will require heavy equipment due to the severity of the crush. Crush. The word hung in the stale air of the cab, heavier than the scent of diesel and old tobacco. The image of the roof collapsing, of the steel and fiberglass folding in on him like a crushed soda can, flashed in his mind. He could hear the screech of tearing metal, the pop of safety glass. He looked out the side window. A green reflector post whipped past in the storm. Mile marker 84. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was 2 miles away. 2 miles from the bridge. 2 miles from the spot where the voice claimed he would die. The Peterbilt surged forward, the engine thrumming a deep, powerful rhythm. The truck wanted to run. It ate the miles with a mechanical hunger, pulling him inexorably toward the designation. The vibration in the floorboards intensified, traveling up his legs, rattling his bones. The rig felt heavy, massive, a juggernaut of momentum that refused to be denied. Frank's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The fear that had been a cold knot in his gut exploded into panic. He wasn't driving a truck anymore, he was piloting a hearse. No, he gritted out. He checked the mirrors. Darkness. Nothing but the swirling void and the faint red glow of his own marker lights reflecting off the snow. Subject was traveling at approximately 55 miles per hour at the time of the incident, the voice supplied, offering another data point for the coroner. Frank looked at the speedometer. The needle hovered exactly at 55. He lifted his foot from the accelerator. The engine note changed, dropping an octave as the fuel cut out. The Jake brake engaged with a percussive rattle, brrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr If I don't get there, Frank muttered, his logic forming rapidly, desperate and sharp, I can't crash. It was simple. A math problem. Distance equals rate times time. If the rate is 0, the distance remains constant. If he never reached mile marker 86, the prophecy couldn't fulfill itself. The script would break. You hear me? Frank shouted at the radio, his voice cracking. I ain't going to the bridge. I'm parking this son of a bitch right here. The voice offered no argument. It merely continued its grim inventory. Partial ejection of the subject noted. Left arm severed at the elbow. Frank shuddered. His left arm, currently gripping the wheel at the 10 o'clock position, tingled. A phantom pain flared in his elbow, a premonition of the trauma to come. He needed to stop. Now. He scanned the right side of the road. The shoulder was a mess of plowed snow and ice, a narrow strip of questionable stability bordering the invisible ditch. In this weather, pulling over was suicide. A sitting duck for the next exhausted trucker barreling through the blind white curtain. But driving on was a death sentence. 3:10 a.m. 5 minutes. Another green sign flashed by, ghostly in the headlights. Mile marker 85. 1 mile. 1 mile to the drop. 1 mile to the black ice. Damn you, Frank hissed. He stood on the brake pedal. The air brakes hissed, a sharp, serpentine sound that cut through the roar of the wind. PSSSHHH. The Peterbilt reacted with violence. The brake shoes bit into the drums, but the tires found no purchase on the slick asphalt. The wheels locked. The truck didn't slow down, it began to slide. The rear of the trailer swung out to the left, caught by the crosswind, seeking to overtake the cab. The sensation of weightlessness in the seat of his pants was sickening. The world outside tilted. The headlights swept across the snowy median, illuminating the chaotic dance of the flakes. Frank fought the skid. He steered into the slide, his movements frantic but practiced. 20 years of winter driving took over. His conscious mind screamed in terror, but his hands knew what to do. He feathered the throttle, trying to pull the tractor straight, trying to regain traction before the 80,000-pound assembly folded in on itself. Come on, he pleaded. Don't you do this. Don't you quit on me. The tires caught a patch of gravel. The truck shuddered, a massive convulsion that rattled the bobblehead off the dash. The springless toy clattered onto the floor. The rig straightened. Frank guided the beast toward the shoulder. The transition from the road to the breakdown lane was rough. The right tires crunched into the deep, frozen slush. The cab listed heavily, tilting toward the darkness of the ditch. The suspension groaned, metal grinding against metal. He pressed the brake pedal again, gentler this time. The speedometer needle dropped. 40. 30. 20. The wind howled louder as the engine noise faded. The snow battered the passenger door, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the metal. Vehicle is a total loss, the voice on the radio said. Recovery teams are advising a closed casket. Not today, Frank snarled. Not today, you bastard. The truck crawled. 10 miles per hour. 5. The green sign for mile marker 86 loomed ahead, barely visible through the squall. It stood like a tombstone, reflecting the high beams. Frank stomped on the clutch and the brake simultaneously. The Peterbilt lurched to a halt. The sudden lack of motion was disorienting. For hours, Frank's body had been compensating for the vibration, the movement, the speed. Now, the stillness felt unnatural. The cab rocked gently in the wind, like a boat on a rough sea, but the wheels were stopped. Frank sat frozen, his hands still clenched around the wheel, his chest heaving. His breath fogged in the cold air. He looked at the clock. 3:13 a.m. 2 minutes remaining. He wasn't dead. He wasn't crushed. He was parked on the shoulder, 50 yards shy of the bridge. He reached out with a shaking hand and twisted the ignition key. The diesel engine sputtered and died. The vibration ceased. The heater blower spun down into silence. Frank killed the headlights. The world vanished. Absolute darkness swallowed the cab. The white void outside disappeared, replaced by a wall of black. The only light came from the dim amber glow of the dashboard clock and the faint, green luminescence of the gauges fading in the cold. Silence rushed in to fill the space. It was heavy, oppressive. The roar of the wind was muffled now, a distant moaning outside the glass. Inside, the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine block sounded like a countdown. Tick. 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 Frank leaned back in the seat, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The air in the cab was already cooling, the draft from the door biting into his leg, chilling the wet coffee stain. He listened. The radio was silent. The static had vanished when he cut the power. The voice was gone. He waited. He watched the clock. 3:13 a.m. The seconds dragged. Each blink of the colon seemed to take an hour. He stared at the numbers, daring them to change. Blink. 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 His heart rate began to slow. The adrenaline that had flooded his system started to recede, leaving him weak and trembling. He rubbed his face with his grease-stained hands, smelling the tobacco and the fear on his skin. I stopped, he whispered to the darkness. I stopped the truck. He looked out the windshield. He couldn't see the bridge. He couldn't see the ice. He couldn't see the Jersey barriers. He was safe. He was sitting on the side of the road, a ghost in the storm, invisible to the fate that had tried to claim him. The logic held. The cause and effect had been severed. The timeline was broken. He glanced at the passenger seat. The pile of trash was a shapeless shadow. The empty Red Bull cans didn't rattle. The silence was beautiful. It was the sound of survival. Frank Miller, the weary warrior of the road, had won. He had stared down the Reaper and hit the brakes. He looked back at the clock. The numbers shifted. 3:14 a.m. 1 minute past the deadline. A bubble of laughter rose in his chest. It started as a wheeze, a dry, rattling sound in his throat, before erupting into a jagged, manic cackle. Ha! The sound bounced off the windshield, harsh and loud. You missed. Frank shouted at the dead radio. He slapped the steering wheel, the leather stinging his palm. You missed me. I'm still here. I'm still. He laughed again, the sound echoing in the cold, steel coffin. It was the laugh of a man who had cheated the house, a man who had walked away from the table with all his chips. He was alive. The coffee stain was just a stain. The voice was just a glitch. The night was just a night. Frank wiped a tear from his eye, his shoulders shaking with relief. He reached for his pack of Marlboros, his hand steadying. He had done it. He had beaten the loop. The clock glowed steadily in the dark. 3:14. Safety. Silence. Victory. The victory was a fragile thing, made of glass and wishful thinking. Frank sat in the dark, the echo of his own manic laughter dying against the cold vinyl of the dashboard. The silence in the cab wasn't empty, it was heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a submarine dive chamber. The amber glow of the dashboard clock remained fixed at 3:14, the colon blinking with a steady, mocking rhythm that seemed disconnected from the passage of actual time. He drew a breath, the air tasting of freezing metal and the sharp, acrid scent of the unlit Marlboro trembling between his lips. He reached for his lighter, the plastic scraping against his calloused thumb. Clack. The flame sputtered, illuminating the deep lines of his face, casting long, dancing shadows against the sleeper curtain behind him. He inhaled. The smoke hit his lungs, a grounding anchor in a world gone adrift. Done, he whispered, the smoke curling from his nostrils. It's done. The Peterbilt groaned. It wasn't the sound of the engine cooling, that distinct, metallic tick-tick-tick he knew better than his own heartbeat. This was different. A deep, resonant moan that vibrated through the chassis, rising up through the seat rails and into his spine. It sounded like a beast waking from a slumber, annoyed and hungry. The cab lurched. Frank's eyes snapped open. The lighter fell from his hand, disappearing into the darkness of the floorboard. The view through the windshield shifted. The green reflector post of mile marker 86, which had been stationary a moment ago, moved. It slid slowly, almost imperceptibly, to the left. The truck was moving. No, Frank breathed. He stomped his right boot onto the brake pedal. It met no resistance. The pedal didn't just feel spongy, it vanished. It slammed all the way to the rubber floor mat with a hollow thud, severing the connection between man and machine. The air brakes, which should have been locked tight, hissed, a long, serpentine release of pressure that sounded like a laugh. PSSSSHHHHH. The rig wasn't just sliding on ice, it was being pulled. Gravity and the malevolent will of the highway conspired against him. The shoulder of the road was not flat, it slanted sharply toward the ravine, toward the concrete maw of the Elk Creek Bridge. The 80,000-pound assembly of steel and cargo began to creep forward, gathering momentum with terrifying silence. "You son of a bitch!" Frank roared. He grabbed the steering wheel, his muscles bunching as he tried to wrestle the tires away from the ditch. The wheel locked. Rigid. Stone. It refused to turn, the power steering dead with the engine, the mechanical linkage held fast by some invisible grip. The green sign of mile marker 86 drifted closer. Beyond it, the Jersey barriers of the bridge waited, scarred and gray, guarding the drop into the abyss. Frank reached for the ignition. He twisted the key. Gore-click. Gore-click. Dead. The starter solenoid clicked rapidly, a machine gun stutter of failure. The electrical system flickered, the amber lights on the dash dimming and surging in time with the truck's lurching progress. The speedometer needle lifted from its rest. 5 miles per hour. The bridge was 50 yards away. 40. Stop. Frank screamed, slamming his hand against the dashboard. The plastic cracked. Logic abandoned him. This wasn't mechanics, it was murder. The truck, his home for 20 years, had become a tomb on wheels. The iron coffin was living up to its name. He abandoned the useless foot brake. His hand flew to the trailer air supply valve, the red octagonal knob on the dash. He yanked it. Nothing. The knob pulled out, but the brakes didn't bite. The lines were empty, or the drums were frozen, or the truck simply didn't care. He grabbed the gear shifter. The stick vibrated in his palm, cold and hateful. If he couldn't stop the wheels with friction, he would stop them with steel. He needed to jam the transmission into gear, to force the massive gears to mesh and lock the drivetrain. He shoved the stick toward the position for first gear. Grrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr lashing together but refusing to engage. The transmission fought him, kicking the stick back against his palm with enough force to bruise the bone. The truck picked up speed. 10 miles per hour. The first concrete barrier of the bridge loomed in the headlight's wash, a gray wall growing larger by the second. Frank didn't think. He acted on pure, animal instinct. He wrapped both hands around the shifter, ignoring the pain, ignoring the vibration that threatened to shatter his wrists. He planted his boots against the firewall, leveraging his entire body weight. Get in there. He hauled the stick down, aiming for the low-range gears. He was raping the gearbox, forcing the mechanics past their breaking point. Screech clunk. The transmission surrendered. The stick slammed into gear. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The drive shaft locked. The rear wheels stopped turning, transforming into sled runners on the ice. The sudden resistance sent a shock wave through the cab. The truck bucked wildly, the nose diving, the trailer slamming into the kingpin with a sound like a cannon shot. The rig shuddered, sliding sideways now, the rear of the trailer trying to overtake the cab in a jackknife. Frank held on. He grabbed the emergency brake lever, the Johnny bar on the steering column, and ripped it down, applying every ounce of remaining friction to the trailer wheels. The tires screamed, a high-pitched wail that pierced the roar of the wind. Smoke, smelling of burnt rubber and ozone, erupted from the wheel wells, visible even in the dark. The cab tilted. The right front tire mounted the lip of the bridge entry. The abyss opened up beneath the passenger door. Stop, damn you. Stop. The chassis twisted. The metal groaned, a sound like a dying whale. The rivets on the hood popped, shooting off like bullets. Then, silence. The motion ceased. The Peterbilt hung suspended on the edge of the world. The front bumper hovered inches from the concrete abutment of the Elk Creek Bridge. The right steer tire dangled over the void, spinning lazily in the empty air. Frank slammed back into his seat, the breath driven from his lungs. His chest heaved, his heart hammering a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. His hands, still gripping the wheel and the shifter, shook so violently that his watch rattled against his wrist. He stared out the windshield. The green sign, mile marker 86, stood directly beside his window. He could reach out and touch it. The reflective paint glowed with a toxic intensity in the peripheral light. He was alive. He hadn't crashed. The roof hadn't collapsed. He hadn't been crushed. He looked at the dashboard. The amber clock stared back. 3:14 a.m. Frank let out a long, shuddering exhale. It was a sound of pure exhaustion, the sound of a man who had run a marathon in a minefield. He wiped the sweat from his eyes, his hand leaving a smear of grease across his forehead. "I beat you," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "I beat the script." He slumped further into the seat. The tension began to drain from his muscles, replaced by a heavy, narcotic numbness. He had stopped the wheels. He had broken the timeline. The accident couldn't happen if the truck wasn't moving. He closed his eyes for a second, savoring the victory. KZZZHHHHT. The radio exploded into life. The sound wasn't the static of the storm. It was a harsh, feedback squeal that tore through the quiet, making Frank jump in his skin. He grabbed the dash to steady himself, his eyes flying open. The amber light of the radio display flickered. Channel 19. "Breaker," a voice said. Frank froze. The blood in his veins turned to ice water. The voice wasn't the clinical, robotic drone of the dispatcher. It wasn't the AI police algorithm. It was a gravelly baritone. It was rough, worn down by decades of cigarettes and diesel fumes. It was a voice that sounded like tires rolling over broken glass. It was his own voice. But it was wrong. It was older. It sounded hollowed out, scraped clean of hope, filled with an ancient, festering anger. It was the voice of a man who had been screaming into the dark for 1,000 years. "You did it again, idiot," the voice, old Frank, spat from the speaker. "You stopped." Frank stared at the radio, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. The uncanny familiarity was a violation. It was like looking in a mirror and seeing your reflection speak before you moved your lips. "Who?" Frank croaked. "Who is this?" "Who do you think?" Old Frank replied. The tone was mocking, dripping with self-loathing. "I'm the guy who thought he was smart. I'm the guy who thought he could cheat the house by hitting the brakes." Frank shook his head. Denial surged, a desperate defense mechanism. "No. I stopped the truck. I saved us. The bridge. I didn't go on the bridge. Saved us." The laugh that followed was a dry, rattling sound, like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "You didn't save anything, Frank. You didn't break the loop." Frank looked out the windshield, seeking an anchor, seeking reality. He saw the snow. The storm outside had changed. The chaotic, horizontal fury of the blizzard had vanished. The snowflakes hung in the air. Millions of white particles, suspended in the black void. They didn't fall. They didn't drift. They were frozen in space, a three-dimensional photograph of a storm. The wind, which had been rocking the cab moments ago, had ceased completely. The wiper blades were stuck mid-sweep, glued to the glass. Time had stopped. "Look at it," old Frank's voice commanded. "Look at your prize." Frank touched the glass. It was cold, dead. The world outside was a painting. "What is this?" Frank whispered. "What did I do?" "You parked," the voice said, the anger giving way to a terrible, crushing weariness. "The crash. The rollover. That's the exit, Frank. That's the end of the script. Painful, yeah. Messy. But it ends." The radio static hissed, sounding like a serpent breathing. "But stopping." Old Frank continued. "Stopping is the glitch. Stopping is the refusal to play the part. And when the actor refuses to say his lines, the stage manager pauses the play." Frank looked at the clock. 3:14. The colon had stopped blinking. It was a solid, unmoving amber light. "You didn't save your life, Frank," the voice said, soft and terrible. "You just paused the moment before death. You didn't drive away from hell. You parked right in the lobby." Frank looked at the door handle. He needed to get out. He needed to run. "Don't bother," old Frank said. "There's nowhere to go. The world ends at the bumper. You made your choice. You wanted to stop. Congratulations. We're stopped. Forever." "No," Frank said, his voice rising. "No. I can start it again. I can drive." He grabbed the key. He twisted it violently. Silence. Not even a click. The truck was dead matter. "You trapped us," the voice on the radio whispered, fading now, retreating back into the static. "Welcome to the waiting room, Frank. It's a long wait." Frank slammed his fists against the steering wheel, screaming into the frozen silence, while the snow hung suspended in the dark, watching him with a million white, unblinking eyes. The silence of the frozen storm did not last. It shattered. It began with a sound from the CB radio, not a voice, not static, but a high-pitched, digital shriek that spiraled upward in frequency, drilling into Frank's molars. It was the sound of a cassette tape being rewound at violent speed, a chaotic scramble of garbled noise and reverse speech. Squeeze-zzht. Frank clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound wasn't just in the air, it was in the steel of the cab, vibrating through the seat, conducting through his bones. The amber clock on the dashboard flickered. 3:14. 3:13. 3:14. The numbers jittered, unable to decide on a direction. System failure, the dispatcher's voice cut through the shriek. It was back to the cold, AI precision, but the tempo was wrong, too fast, clipped, urgent. Timeline instability detected. Subject refusal to proceed. Initiating hard reset in 10 seconds. Frank looked out the windshield. The suspended snowflakes began to vibrate. The world outside didn't look like Wyoming anymore, it looked like a corrupted video file. The black sky tore open in jagged artifacts of purple and gray. The green reflector post of mile marker 86 flickered in and out of existence. 10, the voice counted. A wave of nausea hit Frank, heavy and sudden. It wasn't physical sickness, it was mental erosion. He blinked, and for a microsecond, he forgot where he was. He forgot the bridge. He forgot the coffee stain. 9. His memory was dissolving. The loop was scrubbing the tape clean to record over it again. He would wake up at 3 a.m. He would spill the coffee. He would hear the report. He would drive. He would stop. He would trap himself again. 8. Frank looked at his hands. They were shaking, fading, the grease stains blurring into the skin. He was the glitch. He was the error code in the program. As long as he tried to survive, the program would keep running the simulation, looking for a way to kill him that stuck. 7. The realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The enemy wasn't the ice. It wasn't the bridge. It wasn't the voice. The enemy was his own foot on the brake. The enemy was the survival instinct that had kept him alive for 52 years. That instinct, the lizard brain screaming live, live, was the jailer. It had parked him here, in the waiting room of hell, because it refused to accept the ending of the script. 6. I get it, Frank rasped. The words tasted like copper. I get it now. To break the circle, he had to straighten the line. And the line ended at the bottom of the ravine. 5. The truck groaned. The engine, dead a moment ago, coughed. It wasn't a mechanical start, it was a resurrection born of necessity. The pistons fired with a ragged, uneven rhythm, shaking the cab violently. The tachometer needle whipped from 0 to redline and back. Frank grabbed the steering wheel. It was no longer stone. It vibrated with lethal potential. 4. He looked at the Jersey barrier. The gray concrete wall. The drop beyond. He didn't look at the photo of his daughter. He didn't look at the bobblehead. He looked at the abyss. Not on my watch, Frank growled. He reached for the yellow diamond knob of the parking brake. 3. He punched it in. Hisses. The air released. The brakes unlocked. The truck, perched on the slant of the shoulder, began to roll. Not backward. Forward. Toward the bridge. 2. Frank didn't tap the gas. He didn't feather the clutch. He slammed his right boot into the floorboard, pinning the accelerator to the mat. The Peterbilt roared. A massive, defiant bellow of diesel and torque that drowned out the rewinding shriek of the radio. The drive wheel spun on the ice, screaming for traction, burning through the frost until they bit into the asphalt. 1. The truck leaped. Frank didn't steer for the lane. He steered for the edge. Resetting, the voice said. Too late, Frank screamed. The massive chrome bumper slammed into the concrete Jersey barrier. Crunch. The impact was absolute. The sound was the end of the world, the screaming tear of steel, the explosion of safety glass, the buckling of the frame. The steering wheel snapped in Frank's grip, breaking his wrists instantly, but he didn't feel it. The truck vaulted. The momentum carried 80,000 pounds of steel up and over the concrete lip. The hood disintegrated. The horizon flipped. Gravity took over. The cab left the ground. For a heartbeat, there was no noise, no vibration, no road. Just weightlessness. The Peterbilt hung in the air, a broken meteor plummeting into the dark. Frank's head slammed back against the seat. His vision blurred, swimming in red and black. Through the shattered spiderweb of the windshield, as the truck began its terminal rotation into the ravine, Frank saw the bridge deck receding above him. And he saw the lights. Up there, on the icy concrete of the Elk Creek Bridge, a pair of halogen headlights cut through the storm. A Peterbilt 379. Red and black. It was roaring across the bridge. It didn't slow down. It didn't slide. It didn't stop. Frank saw the silhouette of the driver in the cab above, a heavy, barrel-chested man in a flannel shirt, gripping the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead, oblivious to the wreckage falling beneath him. The other Frank was driving. The other Frank was passing mile marker 86. The coffee was spilled, but the wheels were turning. Frank Miller smiled. Blood filled his mouth, warm and salty. The loop snapped. The tether broke. The darkness rushed up to meet him, not as a wall, but as an embrace. The radio in the falling cab crackled one last time. The static cleared. The shrieking rewind noise was gone. The clinical AI voice was gone. The mocking old Frank was gone. There was only the quiet hum of the open channel. Frank closed his eyes. He didn't need to see the bottom. "Dispatcher," Frank said, his voice calm, steady, and free. "Unit 4 Bravo. Load delivered. Going offline." He exhaled. Over and out. The screen went black.